Picture this. You're 7 years old. It's 4 a.m. And instead of sleeping in your warm bed, you're climbing inside a chimney, a space so narrow your shoulders scrape the bricks on both sides. Soot fills your lungs. Your knees are bleeding. You've been doing this since you were 4. Welcome to childhood in Victorian England. If you were born between 1837 and 1901, there's a good chance you wouldn't survive past your 5th birthday. And if you did survive, you weren't going to school. You weren't playing video games. You were going to work. Today we're going to compare what childhood looked like 150 years ago versus now. And I promise you, some of what you're about to hear will make your jaw drop. By the end of this video you'll look at your own childhood completely differently. So here's my question. Would you survive a Victorian childhood? Drop your answer in the comments right now, and let's see if your opinion changes by the time we're done. Let's get into it. The Victorian era spans 64 years of British history, from 1837 to 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria. On the surface it looked like progress. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the world. Cities were growing. The British Empire was expanding. Steam engines, railways, factories, civilization was advancing faster than ever before. But underneath that progress was a dark truth that we don't talk about enough. Children weren't children. They were laborers. They were expendable. And they died, a lot. Today we obsess over child safety. We have car seats and baby monitors and parental controls on everything. We helicopter parent. We bubble wrap. Back then, kids were sent into coal mines before they could read. We're going to break this down across 7 categories: survival rates, child labor, education, playtime, food and health, discipline, and family life. And here's what I want you to do. Keep a mental tally of which era wins each round. Victorian England or modern day. By the end, we'll see which one comes out on top. But I'll warn you now, the first category is rough. First category, survival and death. Let's start with the most basic question. Would you even survive? Here's a number that should stop you cold. In Victorian England, the infant mortality rate in industrial cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and London was between 25 and 50%. Let me say that again. Up to half of all babies born in working-class families died before their 5th birthday. Today, in the UK and United States, that number is under 0.5%. We've gone from 1 in 2 to 1 in 200. So what was killing these children? Everything. Cholera spread through contaminated water, and clean water basically didn't exist in cities. Families drank from the same rivers that carried factory waste and raw sewage. Scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, tuberculosis, diseases that we now prevent with a simple vaccine were death sentences. A child could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. And here's the part that really gets me. Parents knew this. They expected it. Families would have 8, 10, even 12 children, because they knew they'd lose half of them. Some parents didn't even name their babies until they'd survived their first year. Why get attached to something that probably won't make it? Child-sized coffins were so common that undertakers kept them in stock like any other household item. Now think about modern childhood. A child dying today is so rare it makes national news. We have neonatal intensive care units that save babies born months premature. We have antibiotics that cure infections in days. We have vaccines that have literally eradicated diseases that used to kill millions. A Victorian mother would look at a modern hospital and think she was witnessing miracles. But here's the dark side of all that death. It shaped how society viewed children. When half of them die anyway, you don't treat them as precious. You treat them as replaceable. And that mindset? It justified what comes next. Second category, child labor. If you survived infancy in Victorian England, congratulations, your reward was work. And I'm not talking about chores. I'm not talking about a paper route. I'm talking about brutal, back-breaking, dangerous labor that would be considered torture today. Children as young as 4 years old were sent into factories, mines, and mills. Not for pocket money, for survival. Working-class families couldn't afford to feed a child who wasn't earning. Let me paint you a picture. In coal mines there were children called trappers. Their job was to sit alone in complete darkness, no light, no sound, no company, for 12 to 14 hours a day, opening and closing ventilation doors when coal carts came through. These kids were as young as 5, sitting in the dark, alone, for longer than most adults work today. But it gets worse. Other children, called hurriers, had to drag coal carts through tunnels that were too narrow for adults. They crawled on their hands and knees, harnessed to carts like animals, dragging hundreds of pounds of coal through spaces so tight they couldn't stand up. Many of them worked naked because of the heat. Boys and girls. Some as young as 6. In textile factories, children were prized for their small fingers. They could reach into moving machinery to fix threads or clear jams. The machines didn't stop. And when a child's hand got caught, and it happened constantly, they lost fingers. They lost hands. Some lost their lives. Factory owners loved child workers. They were cheap, earning maybe a few shillings a week. They were obedient, too scared and too young to fight back. And they fit into spaces adults couldn't. The average working child labored 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Many worked 7. Now let's talk about today. The biggest responsibility a modern 7-year-old has might be cleaning their room or finishing homework. Child labor isn't just illegal, it's unthinkable. We've collectively decided that childhood is sacred. That kids deserve to learn, to play, to grow. That shift didn't happen by accident. It took reformers who fought for decades. Laws like the Factory Acts that too slowly limited working hours and ages. And a complete transformation in how we see children. We stopped seeing them as small adults. We started seeing them as children. But here's something to think about. Those Victorian kids, the ones who survived, they were tough in ways we can barely imagine. A modern child would crumble in a Victorian workplace. But a Victorian child would probably find modern life impossibly soft. Which brings us to education. Third category, education. Here's a question. What would you be doing at age 10 if you'd been born in 1850? If you were wealthy, and I mean top 5% wealthy, you might be in school. Boys went to boarding schools or had private tutors. Girls learned music, French, needlework, and household management, because serious academics were considered too much for the delicate female brain. But if you were everyone else, school wasn't even an option. Working-class children had no time for education. They were too busy working. And even if they weren't, there was nowhere for them to go. The closest thing to schooling for poor children was something called a ragged school, charity-run institutions that tried to teach the basics to street children. The conditions were grim. Untrained volunteers teaching in cramped, dirty rooms. No textbooks. No real curriculum. Just the hope that maybe these kids could learn to read before they went back to the factories. Here's a number that might surprise you. It wasn't until 1880, that's only 145 years ago, that education became compulsory in England for children ages 5 to 10. And even then, attendance was spotty. Families needed their children to work. Compare that to today. Education isn't just available. It's mandatory and free for every child regardless of wealth, gender, or background. The average modern child spends around 15,000 hours in school before adulthood. We argue about class sizes and test scores and whether there's too much homework. A Victorian street kid would be stunned that every single child gets to learn to read, write, and do math. But here's the flip side. Victorian schools that did exist were brutal. Rote memorization. Total silence. Physical punishment for any mistake. Teachers beat students with canes, rulers, and birch rods. For wrong answers. For talking. For looking the wrong way. One wrong move and you'd be standing in the corner wearing a dunce cap, publicly humiliated in front of everyone. Modern education, with its emphasis on creativity, critical thinking, self-expression, and emotional well-being, would seem absurdly soft to a Victorian schoolmaster. But here's my take. I'd rather have soft and educated than tough and illiterate. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you even more: playtime. Fourth category, play and toys. Despite everything we've covered, the death, the labor, the poverty, Victorian children did play. But playtime looked nothing like it does today. First, there was barely any time for it. A child working 14-hour days in a factory might have only Sunday afternoons free. That's it. A few hours a week. Second, toys were rare. Only wealthy children had elaborate playthings: rocking horses, porcelain dolls, miniature train sets. For everyone else, toys were homemade. Wooden hoops, spinning tops, rag dolls sewn from scraps, marbles made from clay. Children made their own fun with whatever they could find. A stick became a sword. A puddle became an ocean. A pile of rocks became a castle. Street games were huge. Hopscotch, tag, leapfrog, marbles, hoop rolling. Kids played in the streets, the same streets filled with horse manure, open sewers, and carriage traffic. No supervision. No safety standards. Just chaos and creativity. Now look at childhood today. The global toy industry is worth over $100 billion. A single child's bedroom might contain more toys than an entire Victorian neighborhood. We have video games, streaming services, tablets, smartphones. Children have access to infinite entertainment at the tap of a screen. Playdates are scheduled weeks in advance. Playgrounds are inspected and padded. Every moment can be curated and controlled. But here's the irony that researchers keep pointing out. Modern children have more toys than any generation in human history, but many have less unstructured free play than Victorian street kids did. Victorian children invented their own games because they had to. Modern children sometimes need an app to tell them what to do. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it's worth thinking about what we've gained and what we might have lost. Speaking of things we've gained, let's talk about food and health, because this is where modern life absolutely dominates. Fifth category, food and health. If Victorian childhood had a taste, it would be stale bread and disappointment. The working class diet was grim. Bread was the staple food, but it was rarely just bread. Bakers routinely added chalk, sawdust, plaster, and a chemical called alum to make loaves look bigger and whiter. You were literally eating construction materials. Milk was watered down, if you were lucky. Sometimes it was mixed with chalk water to make it look creamier. Other times it came from diseased cows and carried tuberculosis. Meat was a luxury. When families could afford it, it was often rotten or contaminated. There were no refrigerators, no food safety laws, no expiration dates. You ate what you could get and hoped it didn't kill you. And then there was the water. Clean drinking water basically didn't exist in Victorian cities. Families drank from rivers that carried industrial waste, human sewage, and God knows what else. Cholera outbreaks killed tens of thousands. Children were especially vulnerable. The result? Malnutrition was everywhere. A disease called rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, was so common in industrial England that it was called the English disease. Children's bones grew soft and bent. Legs curved into permanent bows. Spines twisted. Growth was stunted. Dental care? Non-existent. Sugar was cheap and everywhere, but toothbrushes and dentists weren't. Children's teeth rotted out of their heads. Now compare that to a modern childhood. Fresh fruits and vegetables year-round. Fortified cereals and clean milk. Refrigeration. Food safety standards. Expiration dates. Nutrition labels. We worry about childhood obesity and processed snacks, legitimate concerns. But a Victorian child would weep with joy at a modern grocery store. The abundance, the safety, the variety, it would seem like paradise. And when modern kids get sick, antibiotics, vaccines, emergency rooms, pediatricians. A Victorian child with strep throat might simply die. Today it's a 10-day course of amoxicillin and a popsicle. We've added decades to average life expectancy. We've eliminated diseases that killed millions. And most of it happened in just the last 150 years. Modern life wins this round. It's not even close. But there's one area where things get complicated, and that's discipline. The sixth category, discipline and punishment. Victorian children were expected to follow one rule above all others: be seen and not heard. Obedience wasn't a value, it was a survival strategy. Children who talked back, who questioned authority, who stepped out of line, they were beaten back into place. At home, physical punishment was standard. Parents hit children with hands, belts, wooden spoons, canes, or whatever was nearby. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't just a saying, it was a philosophy. Beating children was seen as good parenting. It built character. It taught respect. Schools were worse. Teachers carried canes and birch rods as standard equipment. Wrong answers earned beatings. Talking out of turn earned beatings. Looking disrespectful earned beatings. Children were caned on their hands, their backs, their backsides, hard enough to leave welts and bruises that lasted for days. Public humiliation was considered a light punishment. Dunce caps. Standing in corners. Being mocked in front of the entire class. In factories and workhouses, child workers who slowed down were whipped, starved, or locked in dark cellars. There was no one to report it to. No child protective services. No laws against abuse. Adults had total power and children had none. Now look at today. Corporal punishment in schools is banned in most developed countries. Hitting children at home is increasingly seen as harmful and counterproductive. We have child psychologists, positive reinforcement, and entire libraries of parenting books about gentle discipline and emotional connection. A timeout is considered a serious consequence. A raised voice is cause for concern. A Victorian parent would be baffled. Where's the fear? Where's the respect? But here's what we now know, what they called respect was actually fear. And what they called discipline we now recognize as trauma. Studies show that children who are physically punished are more likely to have mental health problems, more likely to be aggressive, and more likely to struggle with relationships. The Victorian approach didn't build character, it broke spirits. We've learned. We've evolved. And our children are better for it. But there's one more comparison to make, and it's the most complicated one of all. The seventh category, family life. When we think about family, we picture warmth, connection, love, game nights and bedtime stories and, I'm proud of you. That version of family is shockingly modern. Victorian families were large, 6 to 10 children was typical. But emotional closeness, the way we understand it today, was rare. Working-class parents were exhausted. Fathers worked 14-hour days in factories or mines. Mothers worked too, plus all the domestic labor of keeping a household running without electricity, running water, or any modern convenience. Children were economic assets first and emotional bonds second. They needed to contribute. They needed to earn their keep. The sentimental idea of cherishing every moment of childhood simply didn't exist. And remember, with infant mortality so high, getting deeply attached to a baby was almost a liability. Many parents kept emotional distance as a form of self-protection. Upper-class families had their own problems. Wealthy children barely saw their parents. They were raised by nannies and governesses, saw their mothers for an hour a day at most, and were shipped off to boarding school as young as 7. Children were expected to behave like miniature adults, quiet, polite, and obedient, not like actual kids. Now think about modern family life. Children are the center of the household. Their activities, their preferences, their emotional needs drive family decisions. We have quality time and helicopter parenting, and endless debates about how to raise kids right. Family dinners are scheduled. Bedtime stories are traditions. Parents take courses on how to communicate better with their children. A child's self-esteem is considered precious. Some critics say we've gone too far, that modern children are coddled, entitled, and unable to handle adversity. Maybe there's some truth to that. But compared to Victorian childhood, the pendulum has swung toward love, protection, and emotional connection. And personally, I think that's a good thing. So let's tally it up. Victorian childhood was short, brutal, and often fatal. Children were workers, survivors, and afterthoughts. The concept of childhood as a special, protected time of life barely existed for anyone outside the wealthy elite. Modern childhood is longer, safer, and incomparably more comfortable. We've built entire systems, schools, hospitals, laws, institutions, specifically designed to protect children. We've decided collectively that childhood matters. But here's what strikes me most. Victorian children weren't weak. They survived conditions that would break most modern adults. They worked jobs that would be illegal today. They faced death and hardship before they could read. That kind of resilience is almost unimaginable now. Modern children have safety, opportunity, and comfort that would seem like fantasy to a Victorian kid. But some worry we've traded resilience for fragility. That in protecting them from everything, we've prepared them for nothing. The truth? Neither extreme is ideal. What the Victorians got wrong was treating children as disposable. What we might be getting wrong is treating them as incapable. The best childhood is probably somewhere in between, safe but not sheltered, protected but prepared, loved fiercely but also challenged to grow. We've come an incredible distance in 150 years, but we're still figuring it out. So here's my final question for you. What surprised you most in this video? Was it the death rates? The child labor? The brutal discipline? Or something else? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one and I'd love to know what stuck with you. If this video made you think, or made you grateful for antibiotics and child labor laws, hit that subscribe button. We've got more comparisons coming that I think you're going to love. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.